come on in the room. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act for the copyright for fair use. Let me play my disclaimer and then we're going to get to the video. We see what's going on, but I still have to play my disclaimer. So thanks for tuning in to Let's Talk About It Media 21. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and please share if you care. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about what's on Instagram, what's on Twitter, what's going on in the news around the world. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comments, news reporting, teaching, scholarships, and research. Fair use is use permitted by a copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. All comments are alleged, in our opinion, and for entertainment purposes only. And don't forget, the Cash App is Let's Talk About It Media. And have a great day. Stay positive, stay focused. So let's get to the video. You see the title, you see what's going on. Let the news talk about it. I'm sitting here watching anyways. I figured I'd go live.
And make this election about them. I think he's going to be in really good shape.
Hogan, let's do point counterpoint, because you're here, you've made your case. Jen Psaki is here, who used to make her case at the White House podium in the press room. So what is your answer to that?
I mean, I would say from a person who's been watching this closely, Trump has given no indication that he wants to talk about all of those issues. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks, but his campaign has essentially been about how he is the victim, right? And he is representing all of the people who are the victims out there. He likes the accolades from that. He likes rallying the base of that. We will see if he talks about the issues that Hogan is talking about. I think for the Biden team, this is an opportunity we have to see if they take advantage of. When the trial is over, what they've had a hard time doing is breaking through. That's incumbent on them to do. But there won't be as much wall-to-wall coverage because this is a historic moment people should be covering, right? And there will be maybe more space for them to talk about issues that they want to have debates about, whether that is access to abortion and the rights around that, whether that is climate change, whether that is the economy and who's better to fight for the people, working class people. I think they would like to have that moment to break through on that. And I will be interested to see if Trump actually takes advantage of talking about those issues or if he continues to talk about being the victim of a legal witch hunt.
It's worth noting here that even as I think we are, and Hogan flagged this, the Democrats suggesting, some of them, that perhaps this is a death knell for the former president's campaign, that this is a knockout blow. On the other side of the spectrum, you have the former president's son, Eric Trump, saying that May 30th, today, may be remembered as the day that Donald Trump won the 2024 presidential election. And on the other side of the spectrum, we also don't know that yet either, right? So to draw too many conclusions from this at this point does seem like potentially risky.
What's interesting, Hallie, and I know you've memorized all polls and all poll trends, so here we go. But as I recall, after the midterms, Donald Trump was severely politically wounded because of the worse than expected results for Republicans, and Ron DeSantis was on the rise, and we were going into a Republican primary, and it seemed for a moment that Donald Trump's star was falling a bit. And you can look at polls and to the date see that the moment that this indictment came out by the DA here in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, that Donald Trump's poll numbers started to rise. He vanquished this huge Republican primary field, and many Trump allies will say it's Alvin Bragg's indictment, this one we're talking about today, for which he was found guilty, that was the galvanizing political force.
It's clear when you look at the polling numbers. It's clear when you look at the fundraising numbers, because he got a big boost when these indictments happened. He fundraised off of his mugshot in Georgia, which his campaign is again putting out tonight to try to rally the Republican base around him. Now, some would argue that perhaps Florida Governor Ron DeSantis fumbled the ball a bit on his own campaign, could have been a stronger candidate there, but Donald Trump obviously remains super strong. That was, Lester, every show we talked about how strong Donald Trump remained in the polls as time went on. The real X factor, though, remains, and we talked about it then. It helped him in the primary. We just don't know yet how it's going to do.
This is a different set of voters.
Let me bring in Stephen Haynes, NBC News contributor, editor, and CEO of The Dispatch. We just saw the picture of former President Trump walking slowly toward the cameras. Are you worried about, is he worried, is the campaign worried about his image? We're seeing him in a situation here that he's a loser in this court.
I don't think they are worried about that. I mean, of course, on a surface level, nobody running a campaign would like their candidate to be a convicted felon. On the other hand, we've seen the Trump campaign sort of lean into this outlaw image and embrace it. If you look again at his rhetoric, Wildwood, New Jersey, the things he's been saying lately, he's sort of owned this and is using it as a way to galvanize the less engaged voters that the Trump campaign thinks are key to victory in in November.
Okay, we're just looking at the picture of the former president's motorcade. They've apparently gone right to the Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan. We believe that he's now free of the obligation to remain in New York, but at least they're making the stop at Trump Tower.
And he's got many family members with him, especially in these final days of court. We've seen Don Jr. and Eric. We saw Tiffany Trump at closing arguments. Jared and Ivanka, who are, of course, key figures, Ivanka Trump and her husband, Jared Kushner, key political figures and advisors in the first Trump administration, nowhere to be seen. Melania Trump, nowhere to be seen. So it's been interesting. And we've seen also an entourage of not only Trump lawyers, but sitting United States senators and congressmen coming in to fly the flag and support Donald Trump at a criminal trial, which is quite extraordinary. I'm old enough to remember a day when lawmakers wouldn't want to be seen within 500 feet of a politician on criminal trial.
And it was Senator Rick Scott who broke the dam on that. And it wasn't day one of the trial, by the way. It wasn't like the first day.
It was Stormy Daniels' testimony.
Here we're seeing former President Trump now walking toward his residence, and you can hear crowds. Let's listen for a moment. Seen the picture, you're going to see a lot of newspapers tomorrow morning.
You can bet that he's as media savvy as he is. That's exactly what he intended to do. He may have even reflected on his moment at the podium after the courthouse where he looked very serious, very grim, and maybe wanted to have a different picture on the front page of the tabloids and the newspapers tomorrow.
Hey, Tom,
those who still read them.
Tom Winter, what have you learned about what happens now, certainly between now and July?
Sure, Lester. So there's going to be a pre-sentencing report that'll be done. That's standard for anybody who's convicted of a crime. And basically, they'll focus on his background, who Donald Trump is, any sort of factors that the judge should consider for any potential sentence here. That's done. That's automatic for anybody. And there, the judge has a decision to make, and he has a decision to make as to whether or not he believes the conduct that he witnessed, the testimony that he saw, the evidence that came before his court, and the jury's obvious straight guilty verdict here today, whether or not that ultimately ends up in any sort of potential jail time. It's probably pretty unlikely, Lester, given the fact that Donald Trump has no criminal history. The other investigations, they don't count when it comes into this because he hasn't gone to trial in those other cases. So that doesn't come into play. I think as far as the judge's focus, he needs to look at it. I'll note being in court for when his CFO was found guilty, Alan Weisselberg, when as part of the trial into the Trump organization, Alan Weisselberg obviously previously pleaded guilty. But the judge did notice certain things about the conduct of Weisselberg. So what does that tell us, Lester? It just tells us the judge is definitely paying attention, based on my experience in the courtroom, of the specific conducts and elements of the crimes that he would have heard. Whether or not that ultimately impacts his decision in sentencing, well, that's something that we're going to have to wait till July, obviously, to find out. There should be a bevy of filings that will occur. They're told to file anything on the record by June 13th. Of course, the appellate process you've well gone over with Danny. But as far as the next steps in the sentencing leading up to that July 11th at 10 a.m. date at the courthouse behind us here, there's just going to be a number of paper filings. We don't expect anything else with the asterisk on that gag order that we talked about earlier.
All right, Tom, if you can swing your camera over to our correspondent, Laura Jarrett. We'll go to her next, but I just want to bring everyone who might be tuning in up to date. 6:15 on the East Coast, 3:15 on the West Coast, and it was about an hour or so from now that we had just heard the verdict. 34 counts, 34 verdicts of guilty against the former president, Donald Trump, a resounding victory for the prosecution in this case, Laura. So walk us through the charges briefly, what he was just convicted of, when his sentencing is, and what is the likelihood, the potential penalty, and the likelihood that he would serve any jail time.
Yeah, Savannah, just to catch everyone up here, 34 felony counts. These are counts that are typically misdemeanors. They're a falsification of business records. He was charged with doctoring those business records to cover up another crime. That other crime, prosecutors say, was conspiring to influence the 2016 election. That conspiracy happening all the way back to 2015. They say it was born in the Trump Tower in 2015. A meeting between tabloid boss David Pecker, Michael Cohen, his former fixer, and the former president himself, sitting there talking about burying stories that could have hurt his election chances. That was their hook to try to make what is a documents case, a paper case, 34 pieces of paper, into a felony, which is what the jury was persuaded by. Savannah, they were invoices, they were checks, they were ledger entries, and what they said that the prosecutor said that was false, that the jury found true to be true today, Savannah, were that it wrote in the actual ledger and on the check stubs, it said retainer. That retainer, prosecutors said, was bogus. It was false. It was all a cover to paper over what was really the former president reimbursing Michael Cohen for paying off Stormy Daniels' hush money. The hush money itself, not paid by the former president, not even the crime. If Mr. Trump had paid her himself, that wouldn't be a crime. But instead, he used Michael Cohen as this go-between, and that was the prosecutor's hook for what turned this case into something criminal. Now that we have heard the jury's verdict, he will obviously, as Tom said, be sentenced in the coming weeks on July 11th at 10 a.m. here in this courthouse. Judge Juan Merchan on the 15th floor will bring everybody back in for sentencing, which will be another first, having the former American president, then even just a couple days away from the RNC convention, sentenced here in that courthouse. He obviously will be able to appeal whatever whatever sentence he's given here. It ranges anywhere from probation up to 4 years in prison, because as we've been discussing all afternoon here, he doesn't have any other criminal history. He hasn't been convicted before. The judge is going to have to take that into account, but it's solely within the judge's discretion, whatever that sentence is, between probation up to 4 years in prison. Savannah.
All right, let's, as we continue to absorb this verdict, turn to veteran prosecutor and trial attorney Paul Henderson, who I believe is with us now. And Paul, you're a former prosecutor, but many legal analysts of all stripes and all political persuasions regarded this case to be the weakest of the 4 criminal cases pending against Donald Trump. It was the first to be filed and the first to be tried, and now we have this guilty verdict. But it was even referred to at a time as a zombie case, because other prosecutors had looked at these same set of facts and declined to prosecute. Alvin Bragg, the DA here in Manhattan, came in and said, I will prosecute it. Are you surprised not only at the verdict, but how quickly the jury was able to reach a verdict given the complexity of it?
In a word, no. I will say this was a novel approach in terms of how they put this case together, in terms of finding a misdemeanor, but then elevating that misdemeanor into an interpretation that spoke directly to fraudulent association of documents with the campaign that he was running. And even all of the challenges I think you were talking about before, where we had a lot of conversation about what the actual motivation was, and is it improper motivation? And there's challenges to the motivation. Was it political? Was it something that should have been pursued? But I will say what stands out to me is that we went through a fair and transparent process with our criminal justice system. It's not lost on me as I look at this verdict that has come out now. You know, I'm reminded of when I was sitting here with you here at the network looking at the Trayvon Martin case with a very different outcome. It's not lost on me the race disparate implications of verdicts like this. And what really stands out is, separate from the motivations and the antagonistic challenges that came up about the case, are the actual and real consequences from the verdict. You don't get to skip around any of that. You know, I know Donald Trump is challenging all of this right now, and he's saying that the real verdict comes out in November with the election, but there are real consequences just from that verdict. He cannot join the military. Not that he would or could. He cannot get a federal job. I think one of the things that stands out to me is that he can't vote in some states now because of this conviction. He can't own a gun in states like Virginia, Tennessee, Iowa, and Kentucky. He's banned for life with a felony conviction. In states like Florida, Alabama, Arizona, he won't be able to unless all of his fines, fees, and penalties are paid. And we haven't talked about the fine, fees, and penalties, but they're going to be substantial in a case like this. I know there is jail time associated with up to 4 years for every felony conviction, and that's not likely. But the fines, fees, and penalties associated with what's going to come from this verdict are real and will have actual repercussions for Donald Trump personally. I think that's a real way to approach looking at what the consequences are going to be. That pre-sentencing report that's going to come out is going to be very telling in terms of what independent, objective agencies with parole are looking at in terms of the influence for the judges as he makes his sentencing. I'm looking forward to those arguments specifically from prosecutors about what they're asking for in the sentencing because of this conviction. And I will say, just to reiterate it, those consequences are real and absolute. Now, we all got here how we got here through a jury trial that Donald Trump and his representatives were able to participate in. And this is the actual consequence that Donald Trump has been found guilty. In spite of the appeal that I know is coming, there are some real consequences that I think we're going to see leading up to, as I had predicted in the past, that's going to overshadow his own campaign. And we're seeing that happen right now with the sentencing taking place right before the Republican convention. This is going to be at the forefront of the conversations, and that's before we have the consequence and the implications for the other cases that are still pending against the former president.
Yeah, okay, Paul, you raised some good points. And it's important, Danny, as I turn to you, the other lawyer we have with us, to set this in the context of justice. And I remember covering a verdict once where the judge told the jurors after the verdict, justice is done when the system works. Paul was saying the system worked. The system was fair. Clearly, Donald Trump takes a different view of that. But I think about being able to find 12 jurors who said they could be fair and impartial. Nobody can say they didn't work hard or take their duties seriously. None of them called out sick. We never had to use any of the alternates. And you just have to reflect on a moment what we ask our fellow citizens to do when we ask them to sit in judgment of another human being, let alone a high-profile case like this.
It is one of the most important duties as a citizen, and you'll hear lawyers actually say that in their openings and their closing, because it is. It is one of the few purely democratic processes that we participate in, where 12 strangers come together and get unanimous on a particular subject, or sometimes they don't. But they also promise to set aside their biases and judge the facts fairly. Otherwise, they don't make it onto the jury. And getting onto that jury is a commitment. It's a commitment that citizens make. It is probably the highest duty that a citizen of the United States has.
We have a few more minutes before we turn to nightly news. Lester's preparing across the studio here from me, but a word on the political consequences. And again, I guess the order of the day is humility about what we don't know. This has never happened before.
How do you poll on something this unprecedented? Pollsters are trying to do that, obviously, and we do have some signals from, obviously, the fact that these legal issues have been in the headlines for over a year now, at least for this particular case, that there are some slice of the electorate that says that they would be less likely to vote for the former president if he were convicted on this case. We know that about 60% of Americans polled do believe that the charges here, the ones he's just been convicted on, are serious. So there are some tea leaves you could read, but the bottom line is this, and I don't mean to sound like a broken record, it is, think about your own life. It is different when somebody asks you about a hypothetical versus when somebody asks about something that has actually happened. So I do think it's going to take some time to see the impact. Now, I will say we are already seeing, at least in the short term, an impact on the Republican side of the ledger. You've got a source telling one of our colleagues, Matt Dixon, from the Trump campaign, that their website's actually having problems because they say, the Trump campaign, so many people are trying to get on to donate to the former president right now as he is making these appeals.
Well, we will continue to watch the political ramifications as they play out. Both candidates for office, President Biden and former President Trump, agreeing this afternoon that the verdict verdict is Election Day, November 5th. On that point, they agree. I want to turn to Laura. We have about a minute for you, Laura. If you could just put this case in the context of all of the cases, because there are 4 criminal cases pending against the former president. Been concluded, and we await sentencing on that. But the other 3 are not likely to reach the trial stage before Election Day.
Savannah, you're so right. This is likely the only one that will be completed before the November election. The others have been bogged down in appeals and delays. Perhaps the most gravest one of all, the one about the former president trying to overturn the last election, still up on appeal before the U.S. Supreme Court. We've been waiting on that one for the better part of a month now. Still no word on when it will come down. But of course, we also have one in Georgia about also trying to subvert the election. We also have one in Florida about stealing classified documents, hoarding classified documents after he was no longer the White House. He's pled not guilty on all of those. He said they're politically motivated. He said this has been a political prosecution, but today a jury disagreed, Savannah.
All right, Laura, thank you for your coverage. To all of our panel here. Top of the news, former President Donald Trump, current candidate for the Republican nomination for President of the United States. Donald Trump has been convicted of 34 felony counts. He will be sentenced on July 1st. That concludes this NBC News special report. We have much more on our streaming network, NBC News Now. You can also join Tom Yamas tonight for a special verdict wrap-up at 9 o'clock Eastern. Lester Holt has much more straight ahead nightly news. Begins in just a few moments. I'm Savannah Guthrie. This has been an NBC News special report.
I'm Tom Costello at NBC News headquarters. We are coming on the air with that historic, monumental breaking news. Donald Trump, the 45th president of the United States and potentially the next president, guilty across the board, convicted of 34 felonies in his New York criminal trial. On charges that he lied on business records to cover up hush money payments to a former adult film star who claims the two had an affair. Mr. Trump has always denied that. Prosecutors say it was to hide an underlying crime. That crime was related to interference in the 2016 election. The former president, in just the last hour, maintaining his innocence, saying it is up to the voters to decide on November 5th. His sentencing, though, now on July 11th, and that is just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. We are seeing protesters right now in Manhattan, about a block from the courthouse, and we're also seeing a lot of banners saying that Trump is guilty. More of those types of banners, not a lot of pro-Trump protesters in Manhattan, perhaps not a surprise. We're also expecting to see Manhattan DA Attorney Alvin Bragg about 30 minutes from now when he's out with his reaction to the verdict. We want to bring you that live. In the meantime, we have an awful lot happening now. A huge team outside court and here in the studio. Legal analysts, political pros, all of them here to break it down. Rahema Ellis, Yasmin Vasugian, and Lisa Rubin. Let's begin there, outside the court. And Lisa, you were inside the courtroom today. Talk us through what you saw, what happened. Were the jurors making eye contact with President Trump? Did he have eye contact? Walk us through what we didn't see.
What you didn't see was that the judge asked Tom, both sides to come in at 4:15 and told them that he was going to dismiss the jurors at 4:30. And then he said he had to step off the bench and he would be back momentarily. When he came back, well after 4:30, I should add, at about 4:36, 4:38, he said that he had been given a note by the jurors at 4:20 that they had a verdict, but that they needed a little bit more time to complete the forms necessary to reduce their verdict to an official verdict, so to speak. And so when they came back in at 5 o'clock, the foreperson was asked, do you have a verdict? He stood up with a hand mic in his hand, and he was asked by the courtroom deputy, what say you is your verdict on count 1? And they asked him count 1 through 34, and in a clear and strong voice, not looking toward either of the parties, but only directed toward Judge Merchan, he said guilty to each and every one of the 34 counts. And then what usually happened here. The defense was asked if they wanted to take a poll. That means asking asking each individual juror if they share in the jury's verdict to make sure that it is in fact unanimous. And 1 through 12, each one of them affirmed that that was their verdict. At that point, we were done reading the verdict. I will tell you, you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. The only noise was all the clackety clacks of 100+ reporters trying to take down what was happening around them. When we realized that the first count was guilty, I could hear people on both sides of me sort of like breathe in and gasp at the same time. People really did not appreciate that we were going to see 34 counts, particularly since there were moments where, in looking at these jurors, they were skeptical of certain witnesses. They didn't have the kinds of faces that indicated they were necessarily pro-prosecution. They really played it straight. And they were careful. They asked a number of questions during their deliberations, including asking for readbacks of certain jury instructions and 4 different areas of testimony. And so to see a unanimous verdict on all 34 counts, shocking to those in the courtroom, most of all, Donald Trump, who walked out with his jaw set and determined but grim, almost as if he knew this day was going to come and yet was still unprepared for the gravity of having been the first former or current U.S. president convicted of any crime, let alone 34 of them.
But Lisa, did he appear resigned to this, just convicted across all counts, or did he go on truly thinking that he was going to beat some or all of these charges, just by body language, I'm wondering?
By body language, he seemed in very good spirits when he was summoned at 4:15. He and Todd Blanche, his lead lawyer, sitting shoulder to shoulder, conferring, whispering to each other as if they were sharing some extended private inside joke. They were as jovial as two people facing jury deliberations could be, and yet that all dissipated when they found out that they had a verdict. When they learned that they had a verdict, they didn't scoot away from each other necessarily, but you could feel even their bodies moving toward each other. President Trump staring dead ahead, Todd Blanche looking ahead too, and the conviviality of the earlier moment, Tom, was gone in that.
Let's go to my colleague, Rahema Ellis, who is outside the courthouse as well. And Rahema, what are you seeing from folks there? I understand not a lot of pro-Trump demonstrators, but also we know that the president did also have a few comments, right?
We do know that the president has some comments, Tom. We're gonna widen out a little bit, Kevin, my cameraman, and look at this area. Earlier in the day, Tom, this was crowded with pro-Trump supporters, I should say. But that's not the case now. What we see here, we're gonna pan over a little bit. Police officers have come out in large number. They've been out here in large numbers anyway, but we're almost seeing as many police officers as we are seeing spectators. At this moment, there are more people who are in favor of the verdict that came down this afternoon. One person said to me, "I'm glad it's finally over." Another person said it's the right verdict. Meanwhile, a Trump supporter said to me he was stunned, shocked, and surprised, and he will still vote for Trump, no matter what this verdict that came down today. But there was a hush, I have to tell you, when the word came down that the jurors had reached a verdict and it would be read in about 30 minutes. All of the shouting of pro-Trump that had been going on, a quiet fell over this park, just across the street from the courthouse, as people waited with anticipation of what that verdict was being. And then when they heard one count after another, all the way to 34, that it was guilty, it got even quieter than before. And those who were Trump supporters quietly made their way out after they made a ruckus. And then you saw more of Trump supporters. And I have to tell you, Tom, what we also saw was people who came here just to get a look to see what it was like, what it would feel like to be here. There's a little bit of a carnival atmosphere as well. One man came here a little while ago wearing an orange jumpsuit and a Trump mask on, and with his thumb raised. Another person is saying Trump should go to jail. We know there's probably not going to be any jail time for the former president. But the point I'm trying to make to you, if we can pan over here a little bit, again, I want you to see the number of police officers who were here in the crowd. Many, many officers out here, Tom, and not nearly as many protesters for whom they would be protecting this area against. It is quiet here. There is a shock here. People are trying to absorb and to take in what's happened.
Sounds like on
Historic
both
as it
sides.
is.
Yeah, on both
Many
sides of the
people,
political
some of them
spectrum, there's
here now
shock, right,
who
Rahima?
wanted this verdict, others who were dreading this verdict, and all of them, I think, who were stunned by this verdict.
Yeah. My
Tom?
apologies. Didn't mean to walk on you. Thank you. Let's talk to Yasmin very quickly. I understand that we're hearing from Michael Cohen, the former president's fixer, former lawyer. What is he saying?
Yeah, Michael Cohen actually sent out a tweet, Tom. Let me read it for you because I actually posted it as well on my Twitter. I'm sending out a statement saying, today is an important day for accountability and the rule of law. While it has been a difficult journey for me and my family, the truth always matters. I want to thank my attorneys, Danya Perry and Joshua Kolb, for their invaluable guidance and support throughout this time. Also, by the way, Michael Cohen, I believe, is appearing on MSNBC at 8 p.m. This evening. I think it's kind of important to put this all in perspective, Tom, as we think about this. And I think shock is really a good word to be used both by Rahima and by Lisa here, who, by the way, is standing on a box. She's not taller than me in real life. Just to let everybody know out there that's watching. But when you think about when you think about Michael Cohen's testimony and how he was kind of seen as the star witness here, right? He bookended this trial with David Pecker at the very beginning. And there were only 4 questions asked by this jury who deliberated for, I believe it was 9.5 hours or so. And those questions pertained both to Michael Cohen's testimony and to David Pecker's testimony. And it seemed as if it came down to their credibility, really, with their own testimony. And it's interesting and important to think about that as we think about this in the grand scheme of things. And really the last year and a half that Donald Trump has experienced, right? Not only has he been found guilty on 34 counts in the courtroom behind me, he owes over $500 million to Eugene Carroll and Trump civil fraud trial as well. So really an uphill battle for the presumptive Republican nominee for president as we make our way to November, Tom.
Ladies, thank you. Great analysis. And we're also, by the way, waiting for the Manhattan DA. We expect now at 6:45 Eastern time. We'll bring you that live. Let's bring in our team of lawyers here to break this all down. Former Trump lawyer Michael Vanderveen is here. NBC News legal analyst Kristen Gibbons-Fedden is here. Georgetown law professor Michelle Goodwin and former Maryland DA attorney Debbie Hines is here. Michael, you know the president personally, and I'm just curious. What was the conversation in the SUV today with his lawyers going back to Trump Tower? Understanding that he's defiant, understanding he said that he's going to appeal, is it in their interest to also drag out the appeals process? What are they talking about?
Well, first they're talking about the jury and the way they felt that the jury was unfair. They were talking about the evidence that they came in and didn't think should have come in. They were talking about Michael Cohen and what a rat he is. They were probably talking about the appeals, but probably more importantly, they were talking about the political future. How this impacts from now until November and how they're going to handle it and what they think will come as a result of that.
Their public face on that is that he's a political a victim here, but those are the public comments. Privately, do they think, oh boy, maybe this isn't so good for us?
No, I can't disclose any attorney-client privilege, but, the gentleman believes he's invincible. He thinks that he's going to be able to overcome any obstacle that there is, and that's his mindset. His mindset is, I'm going to win, and that I'm sure that mindset isn't in any way jogged by this verdict. And Lady Justice, she's blind, whether it's a president of the United States or whether it's an electrician, down the road.
Kristen, take us through now what happens next, because the sentencing is set for July 11th. That's only 4 days before the GOP convention. So that would feed into the narrative that the Trump team has that this is a political motivated hit job.
It'll absolutely fit into the narrative. But keep in mind, this is the date that actually both the prosecutor and the defense attorneys asked for. The defense attorneys asked for mid-June. And so this
it could work to the Trump team's advantage as well to portray him as a victim.
It absolutely could, particularly if he gets jail time, right? Which I don't think is a likely scenario. Look, he's been convicted of 34 counts. Each carries up to 4 years in jail. But let's really take it down. He's a first-time offender. This is a Class E felony, and though it's a felony, Tom, it is very low level. It's not seen as serious, right?
Let's underscore, these are state charges, not federal.
And that's right.
He remains on bond, and therefore he can go back to Florida if he wants to, right?
He absolutely could, unless there's some type of amendment in his bail conditions, which it doesn't look like there will be. So he absolutely could go back to Florida. He can go anywhere, and he can still campaign. But I think bottom line is it's absolutely going to fit into any narrative that he has. Right?
I'm told that we right now have just received the signed verdict sheets that are into us here at NBC News, and there they are. Those are the official signed verdict sheets. And talk us through the process here. Obviously, the judge has to sign those sheets, right?
Yes. The judge actually already polled the jury, making sure that every juror came up with this verdict unanimously. And then the judge signs it, and that makes it official. That makes it very clear that this conviction was based on the jury trial proceedings where Trump was the defendant. And it was the actual jurors who came up to that verdict.
Right. Can we quickly go to Debbie? And Debbie here, let's talk through this guilty verdict here. How is this going to play out with the former president to appeal? He hasn't announced formally, but we do know that this is the plan.
Exactly. And he has the right, like any defendant in America, has the right to appeal. But you just don't appeal saying, I don't like this verdict. You have to have a legal basis in order to be successful. You have to have a legal basis on which to appeal. There may be some issues that can be appealed on, but you just don't come up and say, I'm unhappy with this appeal. Yeah. This is a bogus process, because it was not. It was justice that was done in this case. So whatever the time period after he is actually sentenced on July 11th, he'll have whatever period of time in New York that he can actually file, he and his attorneys can file for an appeal in the state of New York.
Debbie and Michelle, real quickly, we want to hear what the president said, former president said, as he left court.
The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
Okay, essentially saying that the real verdict comes on Election Day, something that former President Biden's team has said as well as today. And to be clear, Donald Trump can still run for president, right, Debbie? This doesn't change any of that.
No, he can still run. Yes, he can still run for president. He's over the age of 35. He's a U.S. citizen, and those are the only requirements that I know of under the Constitution. So, yes, he can still run for president. But there is a political process, and there is the judicial process. And today we saw that the criminal justice process works in America against the former president of the United States, just like it works in America each and every day against black and brown people that are charged.
Right. Again, we're still waiting here on Alvin Bragg just momentarily. Can I just ask Michael, what would your advice be to the former president about don't make the situation worse? Hold on a second. We do have the DA Bragg who's about to speak. Let's listen in.
First and foremost, I want to thank the jury for its service. Jurors perform a fundamental civic duty. Their service is literally the cornerstone of our judicial system. We should all be thankful for the careful attention that this jury paid to the evidence and the law and their time and commitment over these past several weeks. 12 everyday New Yorkers, and of course, our alternates, heard testimony from 22 witnesses, including former and current employees of the defendant, media executives, book publishers, custodians of records, and others. They reviewed call logs, text messages, and emails. They heard recordings. They saw invoices, bank statements, and calendar appointments. This type of white-collar prosecution is core to what we do at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office.
In the 1930s, District Attorney Thomas Dewey ushered in the era of the modern, independent professional prosecutor. For now nearly 90 years, dedicated professionals in this office have built upon that fine tradition. A major part of our practice during that nearly 90 years has been public integrity work, including cases involving jurists, local and state electeds, public servants, and others. I want to thank this phenomenal prosecution team, embodying the finest traditions of this office: professionalism, integrity, dedication, and service. They are model public servants, and I am proud and humbled to serve side by side with them. The 12 everyday jurors vowed to make a decision based on the evidence and the law, and the evidence and the law alone. Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. And while this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor. I want to conclude by expressing deep gratitude to the NYPD and the officers of the Office of Court Administration for securing the courthouse, all of our safety, making sure the courthouse and all of the other matters that are important in their own right continued seamlessly. They will continue to be and have always been incredible partners. Thank you.
Molly. And do you plan to request a prison sentence? Donald Trump's multiple violations of the gag order that was in place should factor in that request at all?
The judge scheduled a sentencing for July 11th. We will speak in court in that time. He also set a motion schedule. We will speak in our court filings as we've done throughout this proceeding.
Donald Trump has repeatedly targeted you personally and members of your prosecution team. Do you have a response to the former president after this trial is concluded?
I do not.
In February, you decided not to bring a case against Donald Trump. You criticized them. You criticized the executive, March 2023. You criticized when people were going to start to understand that case. How do you think of all that now, seeing the results of that, and kind of put that in context with your personal history?
I did my job. Our job is to follow the facts and the law without fear or favor. And that's exactly what we did here. And what I feel is gratitude to work alongside phenomenal public servants who do that each and every day in matters that you all write about and make the press, and in lots of matters that you don't. I did my job. We did our job. Many voices out there. The only voice that matters is the voice of the jury, and the jury has spoken.
Mr. Steinglass, many people said the prosecution was masterful and flawless. Just want to know how you feel at this moment. Sorry, I'll let you back. How do you feel?
Mr. Steinglass, I think some of you probably saw him speak for a little bit the other day. So he's done his job, as has this team. And he just told me, tell him how I feel. I think you said that. I will just say enormous gratitude. You know, our system, I talked about the jurors at the beginning of my remarks. We have a phenomenal system. 12 everyday New Yorkers. They listen to the judge's directions. They follow the evidence. You saw them in court every day. They were careful and attentive. And so I feel deep gratitude to work alongside them, to be a part of this system. And I just want to echo that this is what we're doing every single day. I mean, during this trial, just this week, right, a ghost gun indictment, Grimaldi's wage theft plea resolution, sex crimes, convictions, all sorts of work that's being done by phenomenal public servants. So we're before you today on this obviously consequential matter, but this is what we do every day. We follow the facts and the law without fear or favor.
If a jail sentence is in the cards, it is likely that Trump and his attorneys would seek a stay on enforcement of that sentence pending appeal. If that were the scenario, would your office object to staying the sentence?
I'm going to let our words in court speak for themselves when we get to the sentencing matter. I'm not going to address hypotheticals. They raise arguments, we'll respond. And I think your question really underscores an important point. This is an active, ongoing matter, right? We have other phases of this going ahead. We will continue to do our speaking about this matter, about issues like that in court.
From day one, kind of the viability of this case has been questioned in all sorts of media outlets, all over the place, including from the defendant himself. Can you respond to any of that, how you feel now that you've gotten the conviction?
So my response, again, is I did my job. And I think particularly I talked about the history of the office. My personal history, I started as a prosecutor in 2003 in the Public Integrity Unit in the New York State Attorney General's office. I served also in the Public Integrity Unit in the Southern District of New York. These are kind of cases I've done personally, and it's a hallmark of the tradition of this office that I'm proud to lead. And I don't want to go into the whole body of litigation, but we now have a federal court decision ruling on the legal theories. We had a state court decision on the omnibus motions. But most importantly, today we have the most important voice of all, and that's the voice of the jurors. They have spoken. Donald J. Trump has been convicted of 34 counts of falsifying business records. Thank you.
Mr. Attorney, your office has been investigating this case since 2018.
Are you concerned about retribution if Trump is elected president?
So
that is the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, wrapping up his press conference after a very successful, of course, trial in which Mr. Trump was found guilty on all counts. Hallie Jackson, not only the anchor of the show, but the chief Washington correspondent for NBC. And I'll give you a lot of time.
Thanks for sitting. Tom, we're glad to have you here. Thank you so much. While I was racing back across the
Absolutely.
street.
Suzanne Craig is here also from the New York Times. And Suzanne, you've spent an awful lot of time in the courtroom. And I'm just wondering, walking out, being somebody who has watched this day in and day out, are you surprised? 34 counts, conviction all the way across?
My only surprise is I was in a betting pool and I thought the verdict would come in tomorrow, but I thought it was, there was a lot of complicated pieces to the case and just pieces really. But when it came down to it, the common sense didn't lead you to any other conclusion. And that was sort of my view all along. There was some debate about, there was two or three checks that weren't signed by him, so maybe they'll get not guilty on that. But if all the other ones were signed by him, and they all were for the same amount, it just looked like it would come down that way. But I have to say, there was a lot of mundane going through that case and covering it every day.
That the jurors had to sit through.
Right, but you were always aware of the moment and how monumentous it was. And today I really think now I'm just sitting really in that. It is just incredible that a former president has been found guilty on 34 counts of
political implication here.
Well, but it's not just a former president, it's the current presumptive Republican nominee, and his sentencing, I'm sure you've talked about it, is just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. I mean, talk about that collision course between the political and the legal here. And by the way, he may be announcing his vice presidential pick, his running mate, in that same week.
Well, I mean, I just want to say one thing, because we saw Donald Trump come out of the court, as he has done many times, and he gave his victim speech, and he pulled a lot of stuff that we heard in 2016 about blaming him and everything.
In this moment, of course, outside Trump Tower.
Right. And the one thing that we didn't hear, it was a question that came after him, and he walked away and didn't answer it. And it was, why should Americans vote for a convicted felon, and that question will be following him around every day on the campaign trail going forward. And that is what separates this from all the other litigation that we have seen in the last 2 years. Yeah. This is a criminal felony, and it's him. It's not his companies. It is him.
But to Hallie now, okay, so we know that he gets a bump with the Republicans.
Exactly.
What happens to the independents?
But here's the thing. I got to be honest, and you know we love real talk here on this show. We don't know. And there needs to be some humility here from everybody, right? Political analysts, the pundits, the talking heads.
Foley does not have a good reputation.
They asked if he were to be, hypothetically, if he were to be convicted, what would you do? About 2/3 of people, you're seeing some of the numbers here, suggested 3/4, depending on the poll. It really doesn't make a difference. They would keep their vote the same. But anywhere from 11 to 23% of independents have suggested they would be less likely to vote for the former president if he were to be convicted. That's not a big number, but this election is not about big numbers. This election is about the margins. It is extraordinarily
close. Those votes go to Kennedy? Do they go to Biden? We don't know.
We don't know. And the other piece of this, it's different. Think about your own life. If you're asked about a hypothetical versus if you're asked about something that has actually happened. So I think we need a better sense of how the American public feels about this. Here's what we do know. A couple things. Number one, that the economy and immigration remain the biggest voting issues for Americans right now. Not legal issues, not anything else. It's those two things that consistently rate at the top of the polls for what people care about. Number two, we know that the Republicans are rallying around former President Trump. The Speaker of the House almost instantly was out with a statement calling this a shameful day in American history. And we have seen a list as long as my arm, an avalanche of responses from Republican lawmakers who are backing up the former president in this. So those are things we know for sure. We know that the Biden campaign is going to make this, as the senior campaign official told me before the verdict there on the Biden side, they want to remind people after what they described as natural amnesia over 4 years.
Commercials?
The drama.
I was just thinking that earlier. I mean, how do you think the Biden campaign will weaponize?
I think we got a bit of it. I don't know that they necessarily will, only but to a huge degree. We're already seeing Democrats fundraising off of this. The Democratic campaign arm fundraising off of the verdict tonight. We got a taste of it with Robert De Niro and his appearance outside court earlier in the week, Tom.
Yeah, but it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? We're going to wrap up. This is your show. Say goodbye.
Oh, Tom Cassell, thank you so much for being here for us. Suzanne Craig, thank you to all of us here at NBC News Now. More coverage picks up right now.
So stay tuned, more coverage.
And welcome to a special edition of Top Story. I'm Tom Yamas. A monumental day in U.S. history. For the first time, a former president of the United States convicted on felony crimes. Donald Trump found guilty on all counts of falsifying business records. In his hush money trial, one by one, the guilty verdicts came in. A Manhattan jury convicting him on 34 counts of business document fraud in connection with that payment to adult film star Stormy Daniels at the end of his first campaign. The motive? The jury siding with prosecutors to corrupt the 2016 presidential election. A mix of cheers and boos erupting outside the courthouse as his fate was handed down by a 12-person jury made up of 7 men and 5 women, all of whom lived in Manhattan. The jury deliberating for 2 days and a total of 9.5 hours. That's all it took for them to come to this decision. Just moments ago, here he is, Trump, with his fist held high, arriving at Trump Tower and met with a cheering crowd of supporters. But right after the verdict was read, Trump addressed reporters outside the courtroom.
This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
And moments ago, New York City's top prosecutor, top district attorney, Alvin Bragg, who brought this case against him, speaking out.
Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election.
And this is still far from over. The judge announcing a July 11th sentencing date. That's just 4 days before the Republican National Convention, where the GOP is set to select him as their nominee for president, and former President Trump is going to announce his running mate. His opponent in the November election, the Biden campaign, releasing this statement shortly after the verdict. Here it is. In New York today, we saw that no one is above the law. Today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. The jury making their decision, listening to 80 hours worth of testimony from 22 witnesses, most notably from Trump's former fixer, Michael Cohen, and adult film star Stormy Daniels. Daniels spending hours on that stand detailing her sexual encounter with Trump and when she received hush money payments. And Cohen, the prosecution's key witness, the man at the center of the payback scheme, the defense working tirelessly to convince the jury he was not a credible witness. And after his former boss was found guilty, Cohen just releasing this statement. Today is an important day for accountability and the rule of law. While it has been a difficult journey for me and my family, the truth always matters. The big question tonight, how will this verdict play out with voters? A Marist poll taken before the decision showing 15% of independent voters said a conviction would actually make them more likely to vote for Trump. Why is that? We're going to try to figure out that tonight. We've just learned that Trump will have a press conference tomorrow. We have a packed show tonight, but we start with NBC senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett, who has been covering it all.
Tonight, former President Donald Trump found guilty, convicted by a Manhattan jury of all charges. Now the first American president ever convicted of a crime. Jurors finding Mr. Trump guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying his business records to cover up a conspiracy to influence the 2016 election by hiding how he reimbursed his former fixer for paying off a porn star before the election. The Manhattan jury of 7 men and 5 women included 2 lawyers, 2 in finance, and the foreman in sales, and reached their decision after 2 days of deliberations, after hearing from more than 20 witnesses over 6 weeks. The prosecution's case largely came down to whether jurors would believe the word of Michael Cohen, Mr. Trump's former attorney and self-described fixer. Cohen was the only witness who directly tied Mr. Trump to the alleged crime of falsifying business records. He testified Mr. Trump directed him to pay off Stormy Daniels so she couldn't derail his campaign. She'd alleged a sexual encounter years before, but Mr. Trump vehemently denied it. Prosecutors argued at trial the former president was desperate to keep her silent, panicked after the release of the Access Hollywood tape, and then covered it all up, approving a scheme to disguise the $130,000 payoff with a phony paper trail through invoices, vouchers, and checks. Cohen's credibility in this case was key, the defense team branding the now disbarred lawyer who'd been convicted of lying under oath as the MVP of liars with an axe to grind against Mr. Trump, while prosecutors argued Mr. Trump chose Mr. Cohen for the same qualities that his attorneys now urge you to reject his testimony. Mr. Trump, who did not testify, reacting to the verdict tonight, attacking the case as politically motivated by a Democratic DA in deep blue Manhattan.
It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
Outside of court, boos and cheers.
All right, Laura Jarrett joins us now live. Laura, first, terrific reporting all day and all throughout this trial. I'm going to hit you with a lot of questions, and I know this is still very fresh, so you may not have the answers to all of them. First up, what is the next step, right? We know sentencing is in July. Can that date slip?
Trump over Joe Biden, but this is a moment.
Okay, so Tom, now this case, that we have the verdict, this is going to proceed to sentencing. And it's not going to move necessarily as fast as people might expect, but it is going to move faster than I expected. We are going to see sentencing in this case on July 11th at the same courthouse in front of the same judge. Before that happens, both sides are going to be able to make presentations about what they think is an appropriate sentence. In this case, given the charges, the falsification of business records that are felonies, low-level felonies, the probation is one possibility all the way up to 4 years max in prison. That's the range. And within that range, the judge has a lot of discretion, Tom. This is an individual, a defendant who's now been convicted that doesn't have any criminal history. And what I mean by that is that he hasn't been convicted before. Set aside the fact that he's facing multiple other indictments for a minute, but he hasn't been convicted before. And so the judge can do anywhere in between probation and 4 years, Tom. And there have been a lot of questions I know today about whether he's going to be put in handcuffs, whether he's going to go to Rikers, whether he's going to have to be in jail while he tries to appeal. All of that are excellent questions. None of this has happened before. All of this is unprecedented. We are talking about somebody who has not only had Secret Service protection now, but also the presumptive GOP nominee. By the time we get to July, we're going to be just days away from the RNC. So I think we all have to sort of take a beat and recognize that the normal process that would play out for every other criminal defendant, it has a reality of the backdrop of the political here. But for right now, sentencing we know going to happen on July 11th, Tom.
So you open the door to my next question, which is July 11th. It's days before the RNC. Can the Trump team appeal that sentencing date? Can they push it down the road, or is that set in stone?
They can try, and we heard Todd Blanche, the lead defense attorney for the former president, today in court talking about the dates in relation to his other criminal cases. Remember, he faces a federal case in Washington. That one's still in flux. He faces one in Georgia. That one's still in flux. And he faces one in Florida. That one indefinitely on hold, Tom. And so the judge, I don't know whether he's going to sort of work around their schedule in the way that Blanche might want him to. But for right now, I think we should proceed under the assumption that this is going to be sentenced on July 11th, regardless of the political consequences and the reality of it being so close to when he is going to be officially nominated as the nominee for the party.
And Laura, this is so important. You know, we've covered here on Top Story so many crimes that happen in New York City, in Manhattan, violent crimes. We covered the undocumented migrants that attacked a police officer and were released. So people at home may be a little confused. Could the former president really be sentenced to prison? I know you sort of set the parameters there, but is that possibly likely?
I just think we have to recognize that we're in uncharted waters. And I don't mean that as a dodge, Tom. I genuinely mean that we haven't seen this before. And I don't know whether the judge is going to want to put him behind bars, given the security risk, as you just laid out, given the fact that he is currently running for office and likely to be the party's nominee. All of those factors, I think, are the reality of the circumstances that we're facing right now. I think it would be obviously a stunning moment to have that happen, but I also don't want to suggest that it's completely off the table, because for all we know, this judge may think that that is the most fair thing to do. Time and again, we heard Juan Merchan say in court, for the purposes of this trial, you are just like any other defendant. And yet we also heard from Juan Merchan, I don't want to have to put you behind bars. Many times when he could have, when he violated the gag order again and again and again, 10 times, anyone else would have been in jail for that. But we heard the judge say, please don't make me do this. I recognize the unusual circumstances we find himself in. And so I bring that up just to say the judge clearly has the reality of what we're facing on his mind as well, as much as he wants to treat him like everybody else.
July 11th is going to be another monumental, historic day for this country. Laura Jarrett leading our team there down at the courthouse. Now, if you've been following this trial at all, you realize that cameras have not been allowed in court. This historic verdict happened, and it happened outside the view of our cameras. But inside that courtroom and in nearby overflow rooms, members of the media were there to witness and document the proceedings. Some of our guests were inside the courtroom, among them NBC's own Tom Winter, who joins us now live from outside that courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Tom, first, just take us inside the courtroom for that moment. What will always stick with you as you remember this day?
Well, a pretty incredible moment, because we were all fairly relaxed as reporters, because at 4:15, all of a sudden the prosecution shows up. Then all of a sudden Trump and his attorneys come into the courtroom, flanked by his son, Eric Trump. And the judge came up to the bench and just said, hey, I called you in to let you know I'm going to let the jury go at 4:30. They'll continue their deliberations, in essence, is what he was trying to tell us. And I talked to members of law enforcement who did not believe that there was anything afoot. The judge stepped away. He said he was going to be back around 4:30. A couple of minutes went by, a couple of minutes more went by, and he came back in and he said, in a very stern tone, he said, we received another note from the jury at 4:20, and they say they have a verdict. From there, the jury wanted an additional 30 minutes, Tom, to basically go through the verdict form to make sure that they were checking off and doing all the necessary paperwork that they need to do as a jury. The entire tenor of the courtroom changed. From the moment the judge said that, there was really a stiffening up, obviously an increase in security. The security incredibly tight for this trial, as you can only imagine. And then from there, the entire kind of emotion and complexion of Trump and his team changed. They had been joking around, his attorney Todd Blanche and him, covering their mouths so they wouldn't be seen on the overflow cameras to the other courtrooms, appearing to joke back and forth the entire time. But once they heard that, the real tenor of the entire defense table changed. They knew that the verdict was coming, whatever it might be. The prosecution also very quiet and sullen. It's a big moment in the courtroom. The jury filing in. I did not see any of the jurors, not saying it never happened, but I did not see any of the jurors make any eye contact with Trump coming in or leaving the courtroom, nor with the prosecution, by the way. At that point, the foreperson, who's the first juror picked, he picks up a microphone, and he's asked by the judge if they in fact have the verdict, and then they went count by count. It all goes very quickly, and it ends up with that straight guilty verdict, as you know.
Tom, with that incredibly tense moment there in the courtroom, Tom Winthrop for us tonight. Tom, we appreciate that. For more on this verdict, I want to bring in our expert legal team tonight, and we have an all-star cast. First up, Bernarda Villalona, criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor who was inside that courtroom today. Adam Kaufman, a former assistant district attorney with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and Misty Maris, a New York trial attorney. Guys, thank you so much for being here. Adam, I'm going to start with you. We had spoken earlier last week, and you weren't too sure about the prosecution's case, right? You felt that they hadn't made their case just yet. What turned?
I think, clearly the jury was not so troubled by Cohen. And they felt that there was enough corroboration to go with what he was saying, to believe in him. I think that was crucial. I think the prosecution, in summation, did a fantastic job. Josh Steinglass did a great job of pointing out many ways that Cohen was corroborated, and you saw him during the summation saying things like, you don't even have to look to Cohen for this. This has nothing to do with him. And I think that pointing out those corroborating elements of the prosecution's case was crucial to securing the verdict.
Bernarda, explain something to me and to our viewers here, right? The FEC looked at this back in 2016. They didn't want to touch this. The former Manhattan DA looked at this. He didn't want to touch this. The Department of Justice looked at this case. They didn't want to touch this. And then here comes Alvin Bragg years later. He puts together this legal theory, and it works. What happened? What did they do right? What did he see?
He had the courage. He had the courage. You have to think, as prosecutors, you need to have the courage to be able to do the right thing. If you see that a crime has been committed and you believe that you can prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, then you do have a duty to bring forth a case. And Alvin Bragg was not scared. He was not scared. He wasn't scared by the tactics of Donald Trump, of his people, or being brought down by Donald Trump or his people. And he had the courage to move forward on this case.
But this was untested legal theory. He was almost going out of bounds into federal election law, and yet he won. I'm not taking anything away from him. I'm just trying to understand what you think he saw and what he did right.
But not really. So in the sense of, I wasn't in the courtroom today. I was outside the courtroom today, but I was there during the entire testimony of Michael Cohen. I was there for jury deliberations yesterday, as well as when they were instructed by the judge, as well as the jury notes, and all of closing arguments. And I saw what Alvin Bragg saw, and that's in the terms of Michael Cohen. So Michael Cohen was credible. He was believable. Is he a person that is troubled? Absolutely. But what I say from day one, after having watched Michael Cohen, if you had a prosecutor that listened to you and got the corroborating evidence and didn't vouch for you, but instead accepted you for who you are, you can be able to sell this case to a jury, because in the end, it's not just falsifying business records. We know that this crime, which would be the aggravating factor, it affected the campaign, and it showed that no one is above the law. And today, a jury of 12, a jury of his peers, called Donald Trump what he is, and that is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records for his actions of trying to interfere with the 2016 campaign. So thank Alvin Bragg for having the balls to be able to move forward with this case.
And I'm glad we're on streaming. Misty, so listen, as a journalist, right, the storyteller in me loves that argument. He had the courage. Alvin Bragg had the courage. But the skeptical cynic in me says he also tried this case in Manhattan. Do you think former President Trump got a fair trial? I mean, he had 12 people that were from Manhattan. We know this is a very blue area of the country. Do you think he got a fair trial?
So Trump's team asked for a venue change. Of course, from a defense perspective, you're going to ask for it. But the political persuasion of a certain county is not going to be enough to get a venue change. And I would say that, especially in a high-profile case where you're talking about the President of the United States, it's a challenge in any high-profile case to find a jurisdiction where there isn't some kind of bias, knowledge, information about the case before going into the courtroom. So I think it was fair for the judge to say this case is going to take place in the jurisdiction where the crime was allegedly committed, because the argument that simply because this is a largely Democratic county would not hold water with any other defendant.
Adam, you believe that those jurors hadn't followed the case, they didn't know what this was about, they were completely oblivious as far as when they were selected for the jury? I mean, do you think they went in there with sort of a tabula rasa, clean slate, and it was, okay, let's hear this case and let's figure it out?
I think, look, I think that they went through a pretty thorough voir dire jury selection process. And I think a lot of people were weeded out. I wasn't in the courtroom to see what they had to say, but I do think that the jurors likely came into court without preconceptions. I mean, everyone knew who the primary players were. You know, to be honest, my thought was that there would be someone who would be a pro-Trump sort of holdout.
There was a juror who looks at Truth Social, yeah.
Right. So, you know, to me, that was the biggest risk for the prosecution, for a hung jury. But, you know, jurors come in, and I think by and large, jurors try to do the right thing. They try to follow the law. They try to be honest and forthright. And it's, you know, it's the system we have.
Bernarda, so, you know, usually when juries come back quickly with a verdict, I mean, if you watch the movies and if you read about legal cases, sometimes it's not guilty. And I know when everyone said, there's a verdict, people started chattering around the newsroom, it's got to be not guilty. So everyone had an opinion, right? You were dead set that they were going to find him guilty from the get-go, and I will give that to you because you were dead set on that. When they came back, and I think it's early because the jury instructions were so complicated and there were so many charges, did you know it was going to be guilty?
Yes. When they said that they had a verdict, and literally I'm in front of the courthouse, and I'm thinking, oh, they're talking about another case. I already reported on that. No, they was like, no, this case that you're in front of the courthouse.
So it did surprise you.
It surprised. What I thought was going to happen is that they will return a verdict tomorrow morning. They'll sleep on it and return a verdict tomorrow morning, being that they just got the read back this morning and they got the jury instructions again, and they hadn't given us a peep of anything the whole afternoon. So I thought they would come back tomorrow. But when they said there was a verdict, I said it has to be guilty because of what I saw in the courtroom and doing the trial itself and the actions by prosecutor and defense. And let's be honest, had the defense not called Robert Costello, I am sure that the jury probably would have been out a little longer, because the thing is, Robert Costello was the biggest blunder by the defense. He was a complete disaster on the stand, and it just looked how desperate and manipulating Donald Trump was.
Missy, I do want to ask you about that. Did Donald Trump lose this case for his team? And I asked that because there were times when we were looking at this case, and Todd Blanche would go into a tangent with a witness in his closing arguments, trying to relitigate whether something happened between Stormy Daniels and Donald Trump at that golf trip. Did he lose the case because he was not only playing to the jury, but he was playing to Donald Trump, and then the Bob Costello thing, which came out of nowhere, and most people said it wasn't a good idea?
Yeah, Tom, I really, from the beginning, said, why on earth are they coming out the gate from the defense perspective and saying Stormy Daniels is a liar? It does not matter. From a legal perspective, any lawyer would tell you whether or not they had some sort of tryst or affair was not relevant to the case. The only thing the jury needed to know is that she was going to sell a story and that they entered into this agreement and so on and so forth. So you could have left out all that salacious detail, the magazine, all of the stuff that the judge called maybe a little much. None of that would have ever had a door to come into the courtroom. So yes, that was a huge distraction. I completely agree with you about Costello. I think that the jury is going to look at that and say, this is the guy you put on. You only are putting on two witnesses, one of which is essentially just talking about a records keeper, and the other, this is your witness. I would have stopped when Michael Cohen said the words, I stole $60,000 from the Trump Organization. I would have said, okay, that's what I rest. Because it's not only central to him being a liar and a cheat and a thief, it's also how much attention is Donald Trump paying to this transaction if he's able to do that right under his nose.
Adam, let me ask you a non-legal question, because you worked in that office too. Is this a good thing for the Manhattan prosecutor's office? And I ask that because so many people are going to look at this and say this was purely political. Does this help New York City in any way? Is this justice? What do you think?
You know, I think that the answer to that question, if you're a Trump supporter, I have a number of friends I was texting with who are solidly of the belief that this was a political prosecution that was brought by a Democratic prosecutor because it was Donald Trump. And if you believe that, then you believe that. No one's going to shake you from that. I try to stay away from the political side and focus on the trial and the technical aspects and the lawyering aspects of it. And agreeing with that point about Costello and whether he should have been called. Is it good for the office? I think that the answer to that question is, for half of the country, it makes the Manhattan DA's office a brave hero, a bastion of justice. And for half of the country, it makes them a pariah that brought a politically motivated prosecution.
Okay, now let me put you on the spot here, Bernarda. If the former president's watching Top Story tonight and he's loving the show and he's loving you and he's like, I want to hire you, put together my appeal, what would you appeal? How would you put together that appeal?
So in terms of that appeal, I think one of the grounds, and probably people are not going to like this, but ineffective assistance of counsel having to deal with Todd Blanche.
You blame the lawyer.
No. Well, we're dealing with an appeal, so we're putting whatever grounds that we think may be able to be heard. So ineffective assistance of counsel, that would be one of the grounds in terms of a few of the blunders having to deal with Stormy Daniels. That even, remember, Judge Merchan doing the testimony of Stormy Daniels was talking about the objections. I was expecting you to object, and you didn't. So not to say that it's a strong ground, but that's one. Second, having to deal with the testimony, of course, of Stormy Daniels. Maybe it was a bit too much, but then again, he opened up the door doing opening statements. If he kept his mouth shut about Stormy Daniels, not saying it just never happened, then it would have changed the complete trajectory of the trial in the sense of how much Stormy Daniels would have been able
Thanks
to
for
testify.
tuning in, everyone.
But
Please
also,
like,
Tom,
comment, and
just remember,
subscribe.
every time
Share
that
if you
the
can.
defense objected
And subscribe to the
their
channel.
objection was
Thanks for being here.
overruled,
Everyone,
that is one
have
of
a
the
great
grounds
day.
that they are
Goodbye.
going to seek to appeal.